Hi there, in this video I will review Chapter 5, Radio. Radio is the oldest form of electronic media. It once dominated global communications, entertainment, and culture. Its introduction marked the beginning of the electronic age of media and revolutionized the entire world. At the turn of the century, radio was the zenith of technology. Near instant wireless communication was a dream come true. Although many of the functions of radio have been replaced by other forms of electronic media, such as the internet and TV, radio will remain a simple yet important staple of modern-day mass media and culture. It all started back in the 1840s when Samuel Morse, the guy who invented Morse code and the telegraph, figured out how to manipulate electricity and then turn it into a communication facilitator. It was communication using electromagnetic waves. The electromagnetic spectrum includes all of the frequencies that light can have and includes gamma rays, X-rays, ultraviolet light, visible light, infrared, microwaves, and radio waves. The existence of radio waves as a part of the electromagnetic spectrum was theorized by James Clerk Maxwell. As electricity was also being experimented with around this time, Heinrich Rudolf Hertz discovered that if one was to create variations of electric current, radio waves would be emitted. Hertz's new discovery proved that radio waves existed, and it means that one can emit radio waves into space by varying electric current. But in 1894, a self-educated engineer from Italy named Guglielmo Marconi invented the wireless telegraphy and harnessed radio waves. But he envisioned his invention initially as only a point-to-point form of communication. Marconi's invention was used to transmit radio waves around the globe and was also adopted by both naval and commercial vessels for ship-to-ship and ship-to-shore communications. The next evolution of radio communication was wireless communication, which came in the first decade of the 20th century at the hands of inventor Lee DeForest. He developed the vacuum tube, or audion, a device that amplified radio waves. DeForest's invention, the audion tube, helped him to go on to invent the wireless transmission of voice and sounds. Wireless telegraphy, a narrowcasting, point-to-point communication format. Narrowcasting was his aim, but broadcasting is what happened. In fact, soon, broadcasting from one point to many points would become the normal method of wireless communication. Broadcasting, by the way, the term came from the agriculture industry. Broadcasting seed is a method of seeding that involves scattering seed by hand or mechanically over a relatively large area. The term was adopted by the communications industry to mean sending out, not seeds, but messages over a large area. Broadcasting got its first federal legislation to protect the medium in 1912. The Radio Act of 1912, enacted by Congress, declared that radio waves were a natural resource, much like national parks, and that for the privilege of transmitting over them, a broadcaster would be required to obtain a license to do so. It also declared that as a public resource, radio should be beneficial to society, both in education and public service. The original bill for the Radio Act of 1912 was initiated during the investigations following the sinking of the Titanic. The Titanic crew used wireless radio messages to attract help, and a few boats heard the distress calls. As a result, 705 lives were saved because of those radio calls. The Radio Act of 1912 mandated that seagoing vessels continuously monitor distress frequencies. In 1919, the founding of the Radio Corporation of America, or RCA, paved the way for the United States to dominate wireless mass communication. RCA had a virtual monopoly on patents, manufacturing rights, and radio transmissions equipment. It manufactured standardized radio transmission equipment and parts, which helped keep frequency interference from non-professional radio stations at a minimum. In 1927, the U.S. government enacted a law that prohibited foreign ownership of RCA or any other U.S. broadcasting company to exceed 20%. It was later changed to 25%. This gave the U.S. government near total control of broadcasting worldwide. And RCA, it continued to be a major electronic manufacturing company until 1986. The 1920s was the decade which ushered in the birth of popular commercial broadcasting. By 1925, American households and businesses were using as many as 5.5 million radio receivers. Radio broadcasting became informative, entertaining, and commercially viable as advertising found a new and lucrative medium. In that same decade, in 1922, the AT&T company created the first radio network, where radio broadcast stations shared content that had been produced at one location. It was a tremendously cost-effective way to broadcast and began a new chapter in the commercial industry of radio. A few years later, in 1926, the AT&T network was reorganized and became the National Broadcasting Company, NBC. David Sarnoff, who began his bright career at the age of 15 as Marconi's personal assistant, eventually worked his way up to RCA's general manager by 1921. Sarnoff was instrumental in the founding of NBC, a subsidiary of the growing RCA company. This was followed by another major network, CBS, Columbia Broadcasting System, an offshoot of the Columbia Phonograph Company. Most interestingly, during this period, the advent of network radio brought forth the popularity of national broadcasts over local ones. It became a venue which began to shape modern American culture. The Radio Act of 1927 and the Communications Act of 1934 created the Federal Radio Commission, FRC, later renamed the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, and laid down the firm ground rules for radio broadcasting and declared that licensees, radio stations, did not actually own their radio frequency or channel. They could only hold their license as long as their station continued to serve the public interest, convenience, or necessity. The decades that followed saw a swift evolution of programming. What began with vaudeville performers swiftly progressed to serials such as The Lone Ranger and The Amos and Andy Show, and soap operas, which were named because of the first major sponsor to the shows, a soap company, and variety shows and game or quiz shows. It was a communications tool for disseminating news and political messages, a frequent device used by presidents. Radio not only reflected the culture of the day, but it also began to play a part in defining it. Listeners came to know and trust the radio for their shows and news, and broadcasting of events happening all over the world. The power of radio was in full force on the night of October 31st, 1938, with the broadcast of a reading by Orson Welles of War of the Worlds, a novel about an attack on the United States by invading Martians. This terrified the nation, as many who listened in believed it was real. When television was invented in the 1950s, most of the top talent and lucrative radio programs moved to TV, taking advertisers with them. This forced radio to reinvent itself. It teamed up with music, and it began airing more candid interview-style talk shows, but it also started playing popular music on most radio broadcasts. The invention of the transistor radio also gave radio a much-needed boost. It was a small, portable radio device that listeners could take with them in their pocket, and most car manufacturers included them in automobiles. Texas Instruments perfects the transistor, eliminating the need for tubes. There was no heat being given off. Transistor radios were very portable and were all the rage at beaches and at work. With the development of FM radio by Edwin Armstrong, the new and clearer static-free transmissions were perfect for music. In the 1970s, most people listened to AM stations, but by the year 2010, more than 75% of radio listeners were tuning in to FM stations. Edwin Armstrong never saw the success of his development. He spent decades fighting RCA for the rights to his patents. Feeling defeated, in 1954, he jumped out of his apartment window to his death. Radio has made stars of disc jockeys, talk show hosts, and political pundits, while some nonprofit, university, and public broadcasting stations remain popular and they broadcast alternative music and talk or educational options. The vast majority of commercial radio stations rely heavily on popular topics, trends in music, and current events to drive programming structure and commercial sales income. The radio industry is a limited competition, meaning many producers, but only a few products. There are still thousands of radio stations, but most are programmed using one of a small number of formats. Some of the formats established in the 1950s are still around today. Here is the descriptions of some of the top radio formats. Top 40 radio was hugely popular in the 70s with DJs like Dick Clark and Casey Kasem, who was the longtime voice of American Top 40. Commercials were incorporated into a format style where a host or DJ talks in between playing songs to eliminate dead air, and rotations were included in the playlists, with DJs playing only the most popular songs on a regular rotation. And rock and roll music found a very welcome new home on FM with the static-free reception. AM radio still has a big audience. During morning drive, it's king when the radio audience is commuting to work and is a captive audience. The news talk information format is the most popular. People tune in and they listen to a show, not music. The format unintentionally favors conservatives. And what about nonprofit radio? Well, there's more than 3,000 nonprofit radio stations that still exist today. The Public Broadcasting Act of 1967 established nonprofit radio. Although public radio is always under assault from politicians, there are currently 32 million listeners per week to NPR. Looking at the current state of radio, despite competition from TV and the internet, the radio industry is thriving. 245 million Americans listen to radio at least once a week. That's 91% of the population of the United States. Despite radio being a rather old form of media, it will never go away. New forms of media supplement the old media rather than replace it. Radio will never be replaced by anything else because it's a form of broadcasting you don't have to look at. This can be advantageous in certain situations, such as driving. Well, that's a quick review of Chapter 5. I've listed this chapter's key terms and their definitions in the last few slides of this video. Feel free to pause this video and read and understand these key terms. And once you've finished this video, don't forget that this video review of Chapter 5 does not cover the entire chapter. You must read Chapter 5 in your textbook, do the Chapter 5 blog assignment on the discussion board, and review the Chapter 5 study guide to help you prepare for your next quiz. And now, here's a look at this chapter's key terms.